I looked down at the newspapers. They were all different, but all of them had the same picture on the front page. It was of a man with grey hair wearing a dark suit and a blue tie, and above him in big letters were headlines like "No More, Refugee Influx Flooding Britain," and "Britain's Needs Must Come First," and "MP Fry labels Buckingham Palace kids radical refugee terrorists." My heart beat fast at the last headline, but before I could read anything else, Mum gathered the papers back up again. "Let's put these aside for now, darling. I don't want you to read the articles because most of it's just silly nonsense." I watched as Mum turned to put the newspapers back onto the counter and then faced me again. "The reason I showed them to you is because I wanted you to see the kinds of headlines Mr. Fry has helped to create today, and for you to understand that there are some people, like him, who think refugee children like Ahmed shouldn't be allowed into the country." "But why not, Mum?" I asked, feeling angry. "They haven't done anything wrong." "I know that, and I'm sure deep down they know that too, but remember what we said about some people being afraid of anyone different to them." "So you mean Mr. Fry and all the people like him are just like Mr. Greggs?" I asked, scrunching up my nose, as if the name smelled. "Yes, exactly," grinned Mum. After a few seconds, the grin disappeared. "And there's also something else you need to know. Mr. Fry, you see, has said it was Ahmed who made you and Tom go to Buckingham Palace that day, and—" "But that's a lie!" I cried out, feeling my cheeks beginning to burn. "I know it is, darling, and so do lots of other people. But that's why I've had a long talk on the phone with Mrs. Sanders and, well, we've come up with a plan." I sat up and, pushing my sandwich plate away, told my ears to listen extra carefully because any plan of my mum's would be the best plan ever. "Now, we think that people like Mr. Fry shouldn't be on the front pages of any newspaper. It's your story and Ahmed's story that people need to hear. So, how would you feel about talking to a reporter today and telling them all about your letter to the Queen and Ahmed trying to find his family and all the things that you've done for each other?" "But you told me to say no comment." "I know I did," said Mum. "I wanted to protect you and Ahmed too, but when people like Mr. Fry start telling lies, it's time to speak out." "So you mean I should tell them about the greatest idea in the world and the emergency plan, the Queen and everything?" I asked, feeling both scared and excited. "Yes," said Mum. "But it won't just be you on your own. Tom and Josie and Michael and Ahmed will be there with you too, and you can all share your story together." I clapped my hands. "Mum, that's the best plan in the whole world." Mum laughed and, getting up, said, "I'm glad you think so. Now finish that sandwich and let's get back to school. Mrs. Sanders has suggested we hold the interview in your classroom, so we need to be there in—" Mum looked at her watch. "Half an hour. Plenty of time for you to wash your face and look your best too. Chop chop." I gobbled down my peanut butter sandwich, gulped down my glass of milk, scrubbed my face, brushed my hair, polished my school shoes, and, checking I had the greatest idea in the world with me in my rucksack, got Mum to tie my school tie extra neatly. I thought I had done everything in 3 minutes, but then Mum said that was good for 10 minutes, which made me look at the clock and shake my head at it. As we headed downstairs to the main door, Mum grabbed my hand and said, "We're going to have to run very fast to the bus stop, okay? Let's pretend all the journalists are zombies out to get us." I nodded and grabbed Mum's hand tightly. I tried to tell my heart to stop thumping so loudly because there weren't really any zombies around, but it wouldn't listen. As soon as Mum opened the door, I ran just as fast as I could, pulling Mum behind me. I heard her say, "In a rush, no comment," until we reached the bus stop. When we got to school and walked into our classroom, Tom and Michael and Josie were already there with their parents, and Ahmed was with his foster mum, and Mrs. Hemsey too. Mrs. Khan was talking to two people I'd never seen before, but Michael told us that one was a lawyer and the other one was a caseworker. "What do you think they're talking about?" asked Josie, looking at the grown-ups standing in the corner and whispering. "Probably about that horrible MP who's saying Ahmed made us go to Buckingham Palace," I said. "Really?" asked Josie. "Mum and Dad didn't tell me anything about that. They just said if I helped tell the story, we'd get some money for a proper holiday." Just then Mrs. Sanders walked in, followed by a woman in a suit and a man with a camera. "It's them," whispered Josie loudly, "the reporters." "Everyone," said Mrs. Sanders, waving them forward. "This is Mrs. Hall and Mr. Myers." We looked up at Mrs. Hall and Mr. Myers, who smiled and waved at us. "And this is Ahmed's caseworker, Mrs. Khalid," said Mrs. Khan, pointing at the woman in the glasses standing next to Michael's mum. We all smiled. "Let's begin, shall we?" clapped Mrs. Sanders. "First, Mrs. Hall is going to speak to the four of you about the greatest idea in the world, and then she's going to speak to Ahmed, with Mrs. Hemsey's help, of course. And Mr. Myers will be filming you all, and then we'll take some nice pictures of the plans. Have you got them?" "Right here," said Mum, holding up my rucksack. After Mrs. Sanders and everyone had finished fussing over our hair and collars and jumpers and ties, we all sat in a row and the interview began. It only lasted 10 minutes, but it felt much, much longer. Mrs. Hall asked us what made Ahmed so special and why we wanted to help him. It was hard answering more than one question at the same time, especially with so many grown-ups and a large camera staring at us. But Tom said it was because Ahmed was the only boy he had ever met who had seen real bombs and guns and had been fast enough to run away from them. And Michael said anyone who had walked millions of miles to come to school deserved to be helped. And Josie said that Ahmed was the best footballer she'd ever seen, even better than her, and that it wasn't fair that he didn't know where his parents were. And I said that Ahmed was the bravest person I had ever met, because even though he had run away from a real-life war and found it hard to speak English and missed his family all the time, he was still the best kind of friend anyone could have. After that, Mrs. Hall asked us about the greatest idea in the world and the emergency plan. So we showed her and the camera the drawings and talked about how we had gone to the Queen for help because we thought she could do anything. "And are you disappointed that the Queen hasn't contacted you?" asked Mrs. Hall. We all nodded. "What would you say to her if you could? In fact, what would you say to everyone out there listening to you today?" asked Mrs. Hall. "That the gates need to be kept open," said Tom without hesitating. "Yeah," said Michael. "They should be kept open for everyone like Ahmed. And everyone needs to help Ahmed find his parents," said Josie, "because it's not their fault they've gone missing." Mrs. Hall nodded and, looking at me, waited for an answer. I wanted to say lots and lots of things to the Queen and the Prime Minister, but instead I said, I think we should all help anyone who's a refugee, just like my Grandma Jo did." I heard Mum gasp as Mrs. Hall leant forward. "Your Grandma Jo helped refugees too?" she asked, looking interested. I nodded. "In the World War, the second one." "And how did she help them?" asked Mrs. Hall gently. I looked over at Mum, who nodded at me, her eyes wide and watery. "She ran away from the Nazi people, and then she helped other people run away from them too." Mrs. Hall cleared her throat and, giving me a smile, turned to Ahmed to ask him about all the things he had seen and what he had run away from. I watched as Mrs. Hemsey helped him translate what he wanted to say in English, but I liked his last answer the best, because when Mrs. Hall asked him how he felt about what we had done, he looked at us and without any help said, "I happy to have best friends on planet." And just like that, I knew the answer to my very last question. When we got home that night, Mum tucked me into bed and said she was proud of me, and that wherever Dad and Grandma Jo were, they were proud of me too. In fact, I think if Grandma Jo were alive today, she'd give you a big fat kiss and tell you exactly what she told your dad when he was your age, said Mum, stroking my hair. "What was that, Mum?" "That the entire world is full of hearts searching for a place to call home. But refugees are different because they don't just look for a home, they look for peace too. And because of that, they possess the most special hearts anyone could ever have." Hearing about what my Grandma Jo had said to my dad made me so happy that I couldn't sleep for a really long time, not until I heard an owl hooting from somewhere very far away. The next morning, I woke up extra early and jumped out of bed. I thought Mum might still be asleep, but she was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea, and in front of her was a newspaper. "Morning," she said, smiling as her mug of tea steamed up her glasses. "Thought I'd run out and get the paper. Look!" She held it out to me. Staring back at me from the front page was a picture of me and Tom and Josie and Michael, all sitting in a row. Tom and me were holding up the greatest idea in the world, and Josie and Michael were holding up the emergency plan. Next to it was an even bigger picture of Ahmed smiling, and above all our heads in big bold letters were the words, "Ahmed, the most famous refugee boy in the world. Exclusive, the children behind the Buckingham Palace protest." "Come over here, you," said Mum, opening her arms. "Let's read it together, shall we? School isn't for another 2 hours, so we have lots of time." Squeezing onto Mum's chair, I read the article with her. It ran onto 2 whole pages, but I liked the bits where Ahmed was speaking the best. He spoke about his family and where they might be, and how he dreamed of being a footballer one day. But he also spoke about his sister being in the sea, and how hard it was being bullied and having horrible songs being sung about him. "I hope that shuts up all the other bullies too," muttered Mum angrily when she read that bit. "Mum, look!" I cried as we turned over the page to read the second half of the article. "There's you!" I leaned forward to see the picture better. Mum was standing next to Tom's parents and Michael's parents and Josie's parents and Ahmed's foster mum, and the words underneath said, "Parents unite to fight against racism and champion refugee rights. Racists like MP Fry have no right to tear innocent families apart." "Mum," I asked after we finished reading the whole article, "Do you think the Queen and the Prime Minister and the border people will see this? Do you think they might all try and help now? Mum squeezed me tight. I don't know, darling, but what I do know is that by us sharing our story, lots more people will be talking about it, and that has to be a good thing. I put my hands down on the newspaper and then had another thought. And do you think it might make people like Mr. Fry and Mr. Grigsby less scared of Ahmed? I'm not sure, said Mum, smiling. But when it comes to people, you just never know. I didn't know about Mr. Fry or Mr. Greggs, but on the way to school that day, Josie said that after her mum and dad had listened to Ahmed's story, they had told her she had been right to make friends with him. And that made me have a thought. Maybe it didn't matter if really horrible people like Mr. Fry or Mr. Greggs didn't like Ahmed. Maybe they didn't even deserve to know him. But people like Josie's mum and dad did, because they weren't horrible at all. They had just been nervous about making a new friend. And we come to the end of chapter 24. I'd like you to think about, if you could be famous and on the news for a single day, what action would it be for? I'm very interested to see what your responses are. Let me know, and I'll see you tomorrow for the last 2 chapters. Bye.